A series of murders in 1936 led to a crackdown on Arabs in Palestine, which escalated into an open rebellion against British authority. Arab leaders then made demands of the British government to end all Jewish immigration to Palestine and to ban all land sales to Jews. After 6 months of revolt, the Grand Mufti called off the rebellion, after which the British were able to send a royal commission to examine the situation in Palestine and suggest solutions. In July of 1937, the Appeal Commission report was published, which recommended partitioning Palestine, which the Arabs protested angrily. The Grand Mufti, Amin al-Hussaini, and the Arab Higher Committee declared that any Arab who supported the partition plan was a traitor to the Arab national movement. Arabs around Palestine began meeting in secret. One informant told the Jewish agency, "Any man who sells land to the Jews will be put to death. Any man who serves the government will be put to death. Any man who destroys Jewish property will be a saint." The Mufti's words reignited Arab violence, which began with assaults on Jewish communities. Moderate Arabs were also targeted, with many prominent leaders succumbing to or narrowly avoiding assassination by the Mufti's agents and loyalists. One of the Mufti's close associates, Ahmad al-Iman, an informant to the Haganah, reported, "The opposition, which was prepared to agree to partition, had to go along with the opponents of partition after they learned of the decision to murder everyone who supported that opinion." An Arab businessman in Haifa described life in the city at the time. "Terror in full force, if not so much in the victim it knocks down, then in its force to cast fear over large circles of the Arab public. No man dares lift his head and fight. The power of these secret terrorist gangs is not in their letters, but in their very existence. The organization is becoming ever more enveloped in fanatic Arab ideology, and is not built on money. The people live in an ecstasy of extremist idealism." Tensions would boil over in September 1937, when the acting governor of the Galilee district, Louis Andrews, was assassinated at a church in Nazareth. The High Commissioner for Palestine, Arthur Walkup, was on holiday in Scotland at the time of the assassination, leaving the acting High Commissioner, William Battershill, to respond. "I had done what no acting person ought to do. I had changed the policy of the permanent holder of the post. It was Sir Arthur's policy to get security more by appeals to reason than appeals to force. I had perforce to change all that after Andrew's death." Walkup was so shocked by the event that he sent in his resignation while on holiday. Colonial Secretary William Ormsby Gore ordered Battershill to take decisive action before more British officials were targeted. At the time, there was no evidence directly connecting the Grand Mufti to the assassins, but considering his role in encouraging violence amongst the Arabs, Battershill decided to remove him from the chairmanship of the Supreme Muslim Council and arrested most of its other members, as well as those in the Arab Higher Committee. Most of those arrested were deported out of Palestine, and those that weren't escaped the country, with the plurality fleeing to Damascus and Beirut. Investigations into Andrew's death led to a group called the Brothers of Qassam, who were also behind the murder of Israel Hazan the year before, which had sparked the revolt. The group was led by Farhan Saadi, who would be arrested in Jenin during Ramadan, and was tried and sentenced to death. Battershill wrote this to the Colonial Office: "There is no burking the fact that the situation is bad. Assassinations or attempted assassinations occur daily. Bomb throwing is comparatively common. Acts of sabotage are frequent. Armed gangs are loose in the country. Reprisals by Jews on a large scale have begun. The Arab assassin is quite happy, provided the man he kills is a Jew, no matter how insignificant." Despite being removed from his office, the Mufti remained cloistered in his offices on the Temple Mount, due to the British authorities remaining hesitant to violate a holy site. But due to the overwhelming amount of evidence proving his involvement in the rebellion, Amin felt it was only a matter of time before the British would come in and arrest him. So on October 13th, he disguised himself as a Bedouin and tried to flee to Lebanon. His boat was intercepted by a French Coast Guard, who decided to place him under house arrest in Beirut because no neighboring Arab country was willing to let him in. A community of Palestinian Arabs had been growing in Beirut since the beginning of the revolt in 1936 by people fleeing the violence. Living in exile in Beirut, the Mufti established his own pseudo-corps of followers and hangers-on. He gave long diatribes denying the Levantine origins of the Jews and denying the history of persecution they had faced in Europe. And amongst these courtiers was the former Arab moderate, Musa Alami. The Mufti and his lieutenants would establish the Central Committee of the Jihad in Damascus, headed by Izzat Darwaza, which was tasked with recruiting, arming, and directing the rebellion. Amin set up a system where he would give orders to liaisons verbally so they could avoid creating a paper trail connecting the rebellion in Palestine directly to him. These liaisons would then deliver the instructions to the committee, who then sent couriers on foot to the various rebel commanders. And I am here to deliver to you a great deal from this video's sponsor, Ekster. Ekster is a premium accessories company that makes bags, wallets, and a bunch of other high-quality products, like this wallet here. This is the Parliament wallet, which is made with environmentally certified premium leather, which holds up to 12 cards plus cash. And it blocks RFID, so it creates an extra layer of protection for your credit and debit cards. It comes in 6 different colors, and of course, does this. They've also got an aluminum wallet with all the same features, but it comes in 14 different colors. And they also have these snazzy leather key rings. And if you're someone who is prone to losing your wallet and keys, then I have good news for you, because they also have tracking devices you can keep in your wallet or attached to your key case. And the viewers of this channel get a special offer. By using the code CASUAL at checkout, you can get 55% off your order between now and the end of the year. That is 55% off on these just ridiculously high quality products. I love this thing. Especially that. Just use my link down in the description below and use the code CASUAL to get 55% off. Thanks again to our friends over at Ekster for sponsoring this video, but for now, let's get back to the history. Despite the Mufti retaining wide support amongst Arabs in Palestine, there were still those who opposed his hegemony. Serious religious tensions were also appearing in the Palestinian national movement. These tensions were deeply grounded, merely exacerbated by both Hajj Amin's base of power in the Supreme Muslim Council and the British propensity to differentiate between the Muslim and Christian communities. Muslims resented the overrepresentation of Christian Arabs in the bureaucracy and the presence of foreign Christian missionaries in the country. The resentment interacted with the exclusivist Islam component of Palestinian militancy, and the question of what role Islam would play in the emerging national identity. While most of the leadership officially set a secular independent Arab state as its goal, popular feelings about the role of religion in politics were difficult to quell. One of the exiled council members, Hussein Khalidi, frequently criticized the Mufti in his diary for fleeing to Beirut, and complained that the Arabs were shooting themselves in the foot by constantly attacking Jewish and British civilians. Along with some former allies of the Mufti, his longtime opponents in the Nashashibi clan hoped his absence would create an opportunity for themselves to take the reins of the national movement. Rajed Nashashibi was in contact with Moshe Sharet, the head of the political department of the Jewish Agency, while his nephew, Fakhri Nashashibi, was in touch with David HaKohen, who was in charge of intelligence operations for the Haganah. On October 14, 1937, violence began with rebels ambushing 2 buses outside Jerusalem, and a dozen other rebels derailing a train going from Haifa to Jaffa. 2 British police were killed in Bethlehem, and bombs were found in a Jerusalem cafe, along with the sabotaging of the Iraqi oil pipeline and attacking the airport in Lydda. Battershell responded by issuing curfews, collective fines, mass arrests, and demolishing homes. The British cabinet would place Archibald Wavell in charge of the police, who then installed military courts and banned the carrying of arms, which was punishable by death. Battershell justified his support for collective punishment in his diary. I doubt whether any Arab really has any ethical feeling against murder, and I am sure Arabs look upon murder as a justifiable and satisfactory weapon to use not only in private feuds, but in political controversies. We shall never get them to change their fundamental belief on this point. The British would also burn the bodies of dead terrorists in order to prevent funerals from turning into riots and protests. They would force Arab civilians to drive ahead of their convoys in order to deter the terrorists from planting landmines. One British general wanted to use tear gas, but lamented that Britain had signed the international convention banning their use. The British authorities in Palestine regularly denied that they were violating civil rights, and the few times they did acknowledge, they were justified as being exceptional. But these practices weren't limited to rural villages. Cities such as Nablus saw people detained and interrogated. As violence and persecution against Jews in Europe grew, more Zionists began to switch their affiliation from the labor Zionists under Ben-Gurion, who advocated restraint in dealing with Arab violence, to the revisionists and Irgun. Jabotinsky would take symbolic leadership of the Irgun, telling them that if Arab violence is renewed and the Jews were targets, that they should not restrain themselves. David Raziel was an Irgun leader in Palestine and wrote pamphlets instructing drill and firearms in Hebrew. On November 9, 1937, Arab gunmen killed 5 Jews in a kibbutz near Jerusalem, and 5 days later, an Arab man was killed in Jerusalem's Rehavia neighborhood, along with 2 Arab workers near the ultra-Orthodox quarter of the Old City, and a bus headed toward Jaffa was also hit, killing 3 people. Raziel would take credit for the attacks, saying, "He who does not want to be defeated has no choice but to attack. The goal of every war is to break the enemy's will and impose the victors." Jabotinsky equivocated, blaming the British for failing to protect Jews, thus forcing the Jews to act. Jabotinsky asked Raziel to warn the Arabs when a reprisal attack was being planned, but Raziel refused. Battershall ordered 24 revisionists, including Ze'ev Jabotinsky's son, Eri Jabotinsky, detained at Accra prison. In January of 1938, a British archaeologist, James Starkey, was murdered by Arab rebels near Hebron, allegedly mistaking him for a Jew because of his beard. This led to the colonial police advisor, Charles Tegart, to initiate a policy of militarization, asking for armored vehicles, fortifications, interrogation rooms, and barbed wire fences along the northern border with Syria and Lebanon. He would enlist the Jewish labor union, Histadrut, to build a fence, as well as the Notrim and the Haganah to provide protection. With Europe seemingly on the verge of war, the British began recruiting and training Jewish divisions and militias to help police Palestine. Many of these Jewish recruits were also members of Haganah, who were becoming more aggressive in their rhetoric, in contrast to the restraint policy advocated by the Jewish Agency. And by 1938, the Haganah had 25,000 members, a fifth of whom were women. Couriers, arms smugglers, and guerrillas were frequently crossing the border between British and French mandates, to which the French refused to police, not wanting to incite another revolt in Syria. Suspects captured near the border were humiliated and brutalized, and it wasn't just Arabs. Jewish terrorists saw similar treatment. By 1939, about 9,000 would be detained without trial in overcrowded, unsanitary camps. As 1937 came to a close, many in the British government were looking for a quick solution to the insurgency. The current wave of violence had been sparked when the Chamberlain government announced its support for partition after the Peel Report was published. Although many in the conservative government were supportive of the Zionist project, they knew that the Jews were more open to persuasion than the Arabs, and thus began looking for a way to back out of their public commitment to the Balfour Declaration and the partition plan, without it looking like they were succumbing to terrorist threats. In steps George Rendel, a British diplomat in the Eastern Department of the Foreign Office. Rendel was an Arabist who believed that the Jews were having too much influence over British foreign policy, while the Arabs didn't have enough. The Arabs outside Palestine have a quite special connection with the Arabs in Palestine itself. The Arabs are a single race occupying a vast area not naturally divided into clearly distinct territories. Rendel was directly involved in ending the first phase of the rebellion in 1936, by secretly reaching out to the Arab monarchs without the authorization of the Foreign Office, despite it stepping on the toes of the Colonial Office. Although the administration of Palestine under the Palestine Mandate was the responsibility of the Colonial Office, the Foreign Office was inevitably much involved in all these questions, if only as being responsible for our relations both with the Arab countries and with the United States. He would later criticize the Peel Report after its publication, saying, "The Arabs are not a mere handful of aborigines who can be disregarded by the white colonizer. They do not represent a dying civilization. They have a latent force and a vitality which is stirring into new activity. They have produced and are still producing great leaders and are capable of patriotism, which it may be unwise to ignore and difficult to suppress. The ultimate importance of Arab patriotism and Muslim religious sentiment should not be underestimated. Are we not, then, by creating this little Jewish state, simply placing on the coast of Asia a kind of time bomb, which must inevitably explode? It is a thankless task to prophesy disaster, but I have seldom seen a case where disaster is approaching more inexorably." This is an early expression of what in international relations circles is called linkage, a belief that the Palestine issue is central to the Arab and Islamic world, and thus any issue there may cause disturbances in other Arab or Muslim majority countries. Rendel would advocate keeping the Jews a perpetual minority in Palestine, capping their population at 40% of the total. Rendel would win over Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden. The issue was debated in a secret cabinet meeting on December 8th, which ended with Neville Chamberlain adopting Eden and Rendel's position. They devised a plan to walk back their support of the partition plan by sending another commission to investigate, with the alleged task of drawing up partition lines, but with the implicit understanding that they were going to recommend canceling partition. Although the leadership of the Conservative Party, as well as the foreign and colonial offices, had been supporters of Zionism for some time, amongst the rank-and-file members of both departments and within the military, there had been an anti-Semitic strain going back decades. Diaries, memoirs, and correspondence from across the British service in Palestine reveal a strikingly broad consensus: affinity for the Arabs in their case, grudging admiration for the Zionists. British officers and officials had an, at best, unconscious bias against the Jews. The cause for which the Arabs were fighting was, to us, understandable and just. Their methods and the means they employed, particularly against unarmed and innocent Jews and frequently against their own people, were often barbaric and inexcusable. But as a general rule, when admiration and liking are in conflict, the latter will prevail. With the average British official siding with the Arabs, the Jews only won out as many times as they did because people in higher positions were sympathetic to their cause. People such as, of course, Arthur Walkup, who had resigned, and Louis Andrews, who had been murdered. From his court in Beirut, the Mufti initially ordered his followers not to attack the British. He wanted them to focus on killing Jews and moderate Arabs. The second half of the rebellion was just as much a war amongst the Palestinian Arabs as it was a revolt against the British or a war of extermination toward the Jews. Arab intellectuals appealed to Amin to issue a fatwa against the Arab-on-Arab violence, but he refused. But as tensions escalated, he would approve attacks on the British. The rebels crossed and recrossed the frontiers and paraded triumphantly in Damascus. British officials had become desperate at their lack of security. They could now be shot at or kidnapped on the roads or ambushed in their offices. Rebels commandeered weapons, supplies, and reinforcement from villages, robbed banks, and set up rival courts. Arab villages boycotted electricity from Jewish-owned power plants, but because most of the oil lamps had been broken by Arab rebels and troublemakers, this left many towns completely dark at night. Rebels would punish the families who were caught breaking the boycott and acted as police in the towns they controlled. The prompt execution of petty robbers and others, and the disposal of their bodies in public places does not fail to excite terror or admiration. Beginning in 1938, the Royal Air Force were brought in to put down the rebels. RAF intelligence would try to familiarize themselves with the terrain and the tribal leaders first. If that failed, they would bomb suspected rebel hideouts from the air, and if that failed, they would tell the people in a village to evacuate and use air power to bomb it to rubble. Soldiers would go to a town suspected of harboring insurgents and force everyone to congregate in the town square, while British soldiers and local police would inspect each home. If they found any firearms, they would plant explosives and blow up the house. As this continued to happen, families would begin hiding their weapons under floorboards, in haystacks, or somewhere in the woods outside of town. By March, the Colonial Office finally found a permanent replacement for Arthur Walkup. Sir Harold McMichael was fluent in Arabic, and in his first speech, he declared his duty was to maintain British authority and restore law and order. But he was sympathetic to the Arabs, stating, "The complete confounding of those who give to history a purely economic interpretation, it is still true that man cannot live by bread alone." Despite the Mufti's intimidation campaign against the Arab moderates, some still worked with the Jewish agency behind the scenes. They would provide weapons for Fakhri Nashashibi in the winter of 1938, despite the Haganah's reluctance. The primary motivation for the Arab opposition to Amin was the assassination campaigns. Rajab Nashashibi revived a proposal Ben-Gurion previously rejected, to have armed Arab units funded by the Jews. He communicates this with Avraham Franco, the secretary of the Jerusalem municipality. "I don't lack men, and I won't lack weapons either. The government has indicated that it will be prepared to give my men the quantities of weapons they need for their defense. But I lack money to buy these people. It is essential to provide each one of them with a cloak, and in the event of a death, it is necessary to give the family a sack of rice and a sack of sugar. With a sum of 2,000 Palestinian pounds, I could roll back terror. We know where the weapons are and where the Syrian terrorists are coming from, and we have the capability of capturing them before they enter the country, and if necessary, to make war against them as well." Rajab Nashashibi focused on the politics of the Arab opposition, while Fakhri focused on the military operations. Fakhri and Sassoon met with the outgoing Lebanese Prime Minister, Khair al-Din al-Adab, who distrusted the Mufti's growing camp around Beirut. They met to draw up a plan for patrolling the border to prevent the smuggling of weapons and to deliver intelligence to the French on how the Mufti was undermining their interests in the region. The Jewish agency would buy the lands of Hanita along the border with Lebanon, where a young Moshe Dayan would receive some of his earliest military experience. It was a daring but wise decision. Jewish Hanita on the Lebanese border would close the gap in the frontier through which Arab gangs infiltrated into the country, and it would demonstrate both the right of Jews to settle the land and their capacity to hold and defend it. even though Arab territory surrounded the area and there were no Jewish communities nearby. A group of Haganah and Notrim went from Haifa to Hanita with supplies to construct a settlement. They came under attack late at night, killing 2 Jews before the assailants retreated. They came under fire again on March 22nd. At midnight, we were attacked. The Arabs fired from 2 nearby hills, and it was impossible to determine their exact location. We had to make do with more or less aimless firing from our positions behind the perimeter fence. After both sides shot at each other for 80 minutes, the attackers retreated across the Lebanese border. On the 4th day, while one of our construction teams busily worked on building an access road, the Arabs attacked. This time we went out to engage the enemy. We hoped to cut off their retreat, but they were too quick and took to the hills before we could catch them. In early 1938, Weizmann was lobbying the British government from all angles and political parties. When meeting with the Prime Minister on March 10, 1938, Chamberlain assured Weizmann that they were still committed to partition. The next day, March 11th, Hitler invaded Austria. As war in Europe drew closer, Weizmann sent a letter to Ormsby-Gore offering Jewish manpower in the event of a conflict, similar to the Volunteer Jewish Corps during the First World War, in hopes of winning the support of the Foreign Office. We could form a force of something like 40,000 men now, and with increased immigration into the future state area, such a force would rapidly grow. The position is analogous to that of 1914 to 1917, if anything much more serious for everybody concerned and for us in particular. The newly appointed commission arrived in Palestine in April 1938. A mid-level bureaucrat, John Woodhead, was appointed to lead it. The Jews prepared for the commission by drafting statements and assembling charts and statistics and policy papers, trying to appeal to the British sense of fair play. The Arabs, however, planned to boycott the commission, while the Mufti urged Muslims across the Arab world to protest in solidarity, and declared cooperation with the commission to be treason. Posters appeared across Palestine instructing people to kill every Arab who communicates with the commission in any form. They also published blacklists of people at mosques, with bounties placed on their heads. King Abdullah was the only Arab to openly work with the commission. He sent them a proposal that called for Palestine to be annexed by Jordan, which would allow Jews representation according to their proportion of the population, and allow moderate immigration into their designated districts. There was immense popular backlash against King Abdullah, who responded, "The Arabs are as prodigal in selling their land as they are useless in wailing and weeping." Abdullah's government had been secretly receiving payments from the Jewish agency to keep it afloat financially, and was constantly on the verge of bankruptcy. He believed the Jews would be financially beneficial to his kingdom, and he wanted Palestine's ports. Yusuf Hanna, the owner of the Philistine newspaper, which regularly published anti-Zionist tracts, would tell the New York Times, "Any Arab would openly admit in private how much plenty and progress the Jews have brought him and his country in the course of their building up a national home. The people of Transjordan have not been dreaming of being annexed to Palestine for the purpose of being attached to Nablus, Beersheba, and Hebron, but have been dreaming of being attached to that piece of Europe that has been so suddenly established in Palestine." Despite its draconian laws on the illegal possession of firearms, the Mandate government had only executed 3 people for it since 1936, but all 3 had been Arab. In April of 1938, a cell of 3 Jewish immigrants from Poland attacked a bus filled with Arabs leaving from Jauna. They were members of Batar, a youth wing of the Irgun, and led by Shlomo ben Yosef, who had immigrated to Palestine illegally. When he and his 2 comrades attacked the bus, they fired several gunshots, all of which missed, and the grenade they threw failed to detonate. All 3 would be arrested and detained at the prison in Accra. Of the 3 Batar youths, one was declared a criminal lunatic and another was declared to be too young, and were therefore immune from the death penalty. But Ben Yosef was ruled to be of sound mind and legal age for execution. Zionist and Zionist sympathizers in Palestine, Europe, and America lobbied the British and Mandate governments to change the sentence. While awaiting his execution, Ben Yosef wrote a letter to his friends in Batar. "Friends, tomorrow I am going to die by hanging, and is there another man happier than I? I am going to die with the complete confidence that the state of the Jews will rise despite all of the obstacles. Long live Ze'ev Jabotinsky. Long live the state of the Jews and its historic borders. Long live the fighting Hebrew youth." Jabotinsky had been lobbying to get the execution deferred, meeting with Ramsey MacDonald, who refused to reverse the decision. Ben Yosef was executed by hanging at 8 a.m. June 29, 1938. Protesters clashed with the police in Tel Aviv, while synagogues in Poland held memorials, while protests were held outside British embassies in the Baltic. On June 30th, Irgun commanders met and debated what they should do, and decided on a campaign of revenge against the British and Arabs, with one saying, "We must create a situation whereby killing an Arab is like killing a rat, where Arabs are dirt, thereby showing that we and not they are the power to be reckoned with. Acts of retaliation will show the British government and the world that the Yishuv is a fighting force. Acts of retaliation will break Arab terror." Jabotinsky would sign off on the revenge campaign, consisting of kidnappings, murders, and acts of terrorism. Just as acts of Arab violence had pushed more Jews into favoring violence, Jewish violence pushed the few remaining Arab moderates into supporting extremism. They kidnapped and hanged a Christian in Haifa, and firebombed a bus in Jerusalem, and shot people in Tel Aviv. Arabs retaliated by killing Moshav members in Tulkarem, and shooting Jewish shop owners in Jerusalem, and bombing a train in Tel Aviv. An Arab market in Haifa was bombed, which killed 21 Arabs and injured a number of Jews. One of the victims was Chaim Weizmann's brother-in-law, to which Weizmann pleaded that nobody seek revenge. By the summer of 1938, the Arab rebels controlled most of the rural areas of Palestine, and had sway in major Arab urban areas. British soldiers would evacuate areas where infrastructure was destroyed, which happened in places like Gaza and Hebron, which made it a common tactic to drive out British forces. Taxis had false floors to hide and transport arms and munitions. The rebels derailed trains. The old city in Jerusalem became a no-go zone for Europeans, who were likely to be kidnapped and ransomed. It was also difficult for Arab shopkeepers, who faced regular looting and arson, with police having little to no presence. Mid-1938 saw another change in tactics. Typically, the British would send in a relatively large force, occupy it for several days, and then leave. These towns often saw reprisals from angry rebels going back in after the occupations, and punished those who cooperated with the British. Subsequently, the British began prolonging their occupations of villages in the Galilee and Samaria in order to deny rebels access to bases and resources, and they would use these prolonged occupations to reintroduce civil control. McMichael recruited Sir Gawain Bell in the summer of 1938. He was also a veteran of Sudan, and was tasked with regaining control of the countryside. Bell would say of the process, "The combing of a village entailed all the men and boys collected and lined up. There would then be a search for the wanted men. This meant that these people were obliged to file slowly past a police armored car in which a government informer was concealed." Bell describes the relationship between the British and the Jews. "We knew that in all of these settlements they were busy training their men and their women in the creation of an underground army, and clandestinely acquiring supplies of arms. I admired but found it difficult to like the Jews. I liked and sympathized with the Arabs, but in general had less admiration for them. The soldiers instinctively felt a preference for the wild men who sniped at them from the hillsides, to the seemingly friendly Jewish settlers who over-keenly entertained them with food and beer. The cause for which the Arabs were fighting was, to us, understandable and just, though their methods and means they employed, particularly against unarmed and innocent Jews and frequently against their own people, were often barbaric and inexcusable. For most of the war, it was the Arab rebels that were bringing the fight to the British and the Jews. But one military official, Lord Wingate, wanted to change this dynamic. Wingate was a fundamentalist Christian from a family with a history of missionary work. He claimed to have received visions from God, which told him to learn Arabic and Hebrew. He would eventually be posted to Palestine in 1936 as an intelligence officer, where he became a devoted Zionist, making friends with prominent members of the Jewish Agency. By 1938, the Arab rebels had banked on a strategy of attacking undefended targets at night, especially the oil pipeline coming in from Iraq. With permission from the colonial police and the British military, Wingate created his own special units of volunteers dubbed the Night Squads, who would ambush Arab rebels launching attacks on seemingly unguarded targets. He primarily recruited Jewish fighters from the Notrim and Haganah, who were more likely to be fluent in Arabic than the British soldiers. Among his recruits was Moshe Dayan, recruited from the Notrim. His work with the Jewish fighters would earn him the nickname of Lawrence of Judea. The summer of 1938 is when the British would finally start turning the tide against the Arab rebels, but it would require oppressive tactics to succeed. Mandate authorities practiced collective punishment for communities where murders happened, or were suspected of aiding the rebels. Villages and homes were inspected at random, breaking down doors, smashing furniture, and spoiling food. They also had a penchant for demolishing or burning down the homes of families merely suspected of being or aiding terrorists. And suspects held in camps would occasionally die of heat exhaustion. The British justified collective punishment based on a belief that the Arabs placed greater value on the collective than the individual, and thus collective punishment was the only way to show them that they were serious. Some of the Zionists supported these policies, such as Moshe Sharet, who suggested that if the authorities couldn't pinpoint the exact village a suspect came from, they should target all the villages in the area. Some villages were entirely depopulated, its residents relocated to camps and other towns, which was followed by demolishing the homes left behind. The British even implemented an internal visa system, requiring people to get permission to leave their hometown or village. The villagers were stuck in a catch-22. If they supported the rebels, then the British would enact immense punishment on them. But if they cooperated with the British, the rebels would enact revenge. The use of strong measures such as imposing fines on entire communities or destroying houses or shooting and killing people, even if only during the course of a confrontation, foments discontent among the British. The measures cause suffering to good people along with bad and are all the more troubling when British officials and soldiers are killed. In the summer of 1938, rumors spread that the British were planning on removing the Galilee from the Jewish portion of the partition, which accelerated land purchases and construction. Galilee is in danger. We need to conquer the lands at once. Without conquest, there is no value to purchase. Some Zionists within the Mapai called for the Jewish agency to declare independence, though officials like Moshe Sharet thought this was crazy. A growing number of British officials in Palestine began recommending the Home Office to grant independence to the Arab Palestinians immediately in order to win their support in the oncoming war in Europe. In July 1938, a bomb exploded on a bus driving through the Arab quarter of Haifa. A crowd of local Arabs gathered and started throwing stones at passing Jewish cars. A Jewish businessman was dragged from his vehicle and stabbed to death. A Jewish policeman apprehended the murderer and handed them over to an Arab officer, who proceeded to let the murderer go. This behavior resulted in mass firings of Arab officers, which weakened police manpower, thus requiring them to work more closely with Jewish officers, which subsequently caused more anger amongst the Arabs. By 1939, all Arab police had been disarmed or reassigned to clerical jobs. July 1938 saw 60 Jews killed across the country, by far the bloodiest month since the uprising began. But the monthly toll for Arabs was over 100. For the first time since the Great Revolt began, for the first time in Palestine's history, Jews were killing more Arabs than the reverse. Ben-Gurion said of the violence, "Poor peasants went to their city to sell the fruits of their labor, straight, honest men, and here come masses of Jews and kill them. What is the Arab to think? Does it not immediately create dozens, hundreds of new terrorists?" Harold McMichael wrote to the Secretary of State for the Colonies, "The position is deteriorating rapidly and has reached a stage at which rebel leaders are more feared and respected than we are. The movement is definitely a national one, though financed partly by blackmail levied on large scale in the country. It's an attempt to achieve the complete reversal of government policy regarding partition and Jewish immigration. However much the villagers may groan under the bandits, they will not turn to us for two reasons. A, because they fear being swamped by the Jews, and B, because we are not in a position to protect them." In September 1938, an army truck ran over a mine near al-Bassa, killing an officer and 3 soldiers. The next morning, British troops entered al-Bassa, shot 4 people, beat numerous residents with their rifles, and searched and looted their homes. One British official responded to complaints about reports of abuse from British soldiers. In the conditions of sub-war, which we now see in Palestine, there is bound to be a good deal of rough play by troops and police, and, though this could hardly be admitted in public, it is justifiable up to a point as a means of convincing the inhabitants that terrorism and the shielding of terrorists do not pay. Ben-Gurion was one of the few Zionist leaders capable of looking at the situation from both Arab and British perspectives. Let us not delude ourselves. We are facing not terror but war. This is a national war the Arabs have declared upon us. Terror is just one of its means. This is the active resistance of the Arabs of the land of Israel to the plunder of their homeland by the Jews. That is how the Arabs see things. And that is why they fight. When a nation fights the expropriation of its country, it does not get tired so easily. This blood war is just one manifestation of the conflict. The Arab-Jewish fight is fundamentally political, and on the political level, it is as if we are the aggressors and the Arabs the defenders. In the political battle, they have the advantage. The soil, villages, mountains, and roads are in their hands. The country is in their hands, because they inhabit it. And we just want to come and take hold of it. As they see it, we want to take the land from their hands while we are still outside it. The moderates continued to secretly work with the Zionists. Fakhri Nashashibi orchestrated a propaganda campaign against the Mufti in the fall of 1938. which was directed at Arab Palestinians and the wider Arab world. The Mufti is criticized for hijacking the Arab national movement for his own personal gain. They published a pamphlet titled, "A Voice from the Graves of Palestine," blaming the Mufti for the deaths of thousands of innocent Arabs killed in Arab-on-Arab violence. Fakhri also established his own armed group after the assassination of his ally, Ibrahim Abd al-Razak, which he called peace units in the Ramallah region. Similar groups would be established in Samaria, Hebron, and Galilee. He would claim that 70% of Palestinian Arabs were against the Mufti, and that the Mufti was not their legitimate representative. Although the tide on the ground in Palestine had begun to shift, dark clouds were gathering in Europe. On September 30th, 1938, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain met with Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini in Munich. The three signed an agreement in which Britain and France would allow Germany to annex the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. Chamberlain returned to Britain with the agreement in hand, infamously proclaiming it to be peace in our time.
This morning, I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine. We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.